Hello again. Firstly, what I'm now going to present is a short summary of what I describe in more detail in Freedom Essay 53. So, in the previous video, I put forward the argument that the human condition is a result of a clash between our instincts and conscious mind. What I now want to point out and talk about is that I'm not the first person to recognize that this clash is the cause of the human condition. As I describe in my book Freedom, The End of the Human Condition, there have been many thinkers throughout history who have recognized that the answer to our angry and egocentric and alienated human condition lay in understanding that a clash must have occurred between our already established instincts and more recently emerged conscious mind. Before presenting the work of some of these thinkers from ancient time, I should explain that all that's needed to produce a psychologically upset state in a species is for it to become fully conscious, because that self-adjusting capability will naturally have to defy the non-insightful, intolerant, dictatorial instincts. It doesn't matter what the particular orientation of the species' instincts are. The fact that the instincts are non-insightful means that an upsetting clash with the insight-based, self-adjusting conscious mind simply has to occur. So irrespective of a species' instinctive orientation, if it develops a fully conscious mind, an upsetting battle has to occur between those instincts and the conscious mind. But importantly, this doesn't mean that the particular orientation of a species' instincts can't have an impact on the clash with the conscious mind. It can affect it very greatly, as it did when we humans became fully conscious. As Tony Gowing pointed out in the second video of the series, we humans have cooperative and loving moral instincts, the voice or expression of which we call our conscience. As Tony said, Charles Darwin recognized our distinctive moral nature when he said that the moral sense affords the best and highest distinction between man and the lower animals. Now, what's so significant about humans having cooperative and loving moral instincts is that when we became fully conscious and began experimenting and understanding, and were criticized by our instincts and unavoidably responded in an angry, egocentric and alienated way, that, which is what I said actually happened in the last video, that divisive response caused even greater criticism from our instincts, because our instincts expect us to behave cooperatively and lovingly, in fact, in the opposite way. So, in our necessary search for understanding, we were firstly unjustly condemned for defying our instincts, and then again for reacting to that condemnation in a way that was offensive to those instincts. So we had to endure, as it were, a double whammy of criticism when we became conscious. This particular double whammy effect from having moral instincts is described in Freedom Essay 24 and in depth in I think it's chapter 3.5 of Freedom. Significantly, as I'll talk much more about shortly, our conscious mind, terrible double whammy of guilt from having offended our species' moral instincts, is the core reason for all the underlying immense insecurity and upset behaviour apparent in our human condition. In particular, I'll describe how this great guilt and insecurity is the reason why we have been so attached to the patently dishonest savage instincts excuse that Tony Gowing described in the second video. By the way, I strongly suggest you print out a copy of the transcript of this talk so you can better follow what I'm saying. And you also might have to watch or listen to it a few times to take it all in, because it's all logical and straightforward what I'm saying, but there is a bit to think about. Okay. Having explained that the conflict between the instinct and intellect in our species' case was greatly compounded by our cooperative and loving moral instincts, I want to now present the recognition of this conflict by some of the greatest thinkers from ancient times. Later I'll mention thinkers from contemporary times. I already mentioned in my previous presentation the great Hebrew prophet Moses, who 3,500 years ago in the Bible, he wrote the story of Adam and Eve, and that describes them as living in the Garden of Eden, state of original innocence. I mean, if you look up the word Edenic in the dictionary, Edenic, it means the first home of Adam and Eve, a state of innocence, bliss, or ultimate happiness. So Adam and Eve were living in the Garden of Eden of original innocence, state of original innocence, and Moses describes how they then took the fruit from the tree of knowledge, obviously meaning they became conscious, at which point they became sufferers of divisive behaviour or sin. So that's an acknowledgement that we once lived cooperatively and lovingly, and then became conscious and seemingly lost the plot by becoming evil, guilty, competitive and aggressive sinners, supposedly deserving of banishment from the Garden of Eden. Of course, what is missing from Moses' account is the critically important redeeming explanation for why the search for knowledge made us angry, egocentric and alienated, which, as I emphasised in my previous presentation, science has since made possible with its discovery of genes and nerves and how they operate. Namely that while genes can give species orientations, nerves need to understand cause and effect. Nevertheless, all the elements involved in producing the human condition of moral instincts at odds with a conscious mind are present in Moses' story of Adam and Eve. Similar acknowledgements of our species' past cooperative and loving existence, which became corrupted when we became conscious, can be found in other religions. For example, in Zen Buddhism, Zen Buddhism speaks of a loss or of an uncontaminated pure state as a result of the intervening conscious mind, referring to the effective contamination or interference of the conscious mind predominated by intellection. And Taoist scripture features a description of our distant forebears as being the men of perfect virtue. Indeed, it's true that as the American author Richard Heinberg points out in his book Memories and Visions of Paradise, every human culture has a myth involving both the emergence of consciousness and a fall from an original golden age of togetherness and peace. As Heinberg summarised in his book, every religion begins with the recognition that human consciousness has been separated from the divine source, that a former sense of oneness has been lost. Everywhere in religion and myth, there is an acknowledgement that we have departed from an original innocence and can return to it only through the resolution of some profound inner discord. The cause of the fall is described variously as disobedience, as eating of the forbidden fruit, which is the Garden of Eden story, and as spiritual amnesia, i.e. mental blocking out or forgetting or alienation. Again, that resolution of some profound inner discord that Heinberg talked about between our separated original state of innocence and conscious mind depended on science providing insight into the way genes and nerves work. Later in Freedom Essay 53, which, as I've mentioned, is a longer, more complete presentation of what I'm explaining in this talk, I include Heinberg's description of many of these myths and religious teachings from different cultures that recognise the elements of the human condition of the naive, innocent, cooperative and loving instincts versus a newly developed conscious, self-adjusting mind. He describes these myths from such cultures as the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Hebrews, the Egyptians, Africans, Hindus, Americans, Chinese, Romans and Greeks. So everywhere he went, he found evidence of this recognition of these elements of instinct and intellect at odds, causing the human condition. As an example of these that he mentioned, in the case of ancient Greeks, Heinberg quotes the very great Greek poet Hesiod, who approximately 800 BC, wrote this about our species' pre-conscious time. When gods alike and mortals rose to birth, a golden race the immortals formed on earth. Like gods they lived with calm, untroubled mind, free from the toils and anguish of our kind. No decrepit age misshaped their frame, strangers to ill their lives in feasts flowed by. Dying they sank in sleep, but nor seemed to die. Theirs was each good, the life-sustaining soil, yielding its copious fruits, unbridled by toil. They with abundant goods, midst quiet lands, all willing shared the gathering of their hands. So yes, they didn't have a troubled conscious mind, and they lived a sharing, gentle life. Hesiod also recounted how this golden age came to an end when Prometheus stole fire being the representation of consciousness, from his fellow gods and gave it to humans, enraging the gods, and Zeus in particular, who punished Prometheus by having him strapped to the top of a mountain where every day an eagle gorged on his liver. And he also punished humanity by creating the infamous woman Pandora, who opened a giant box containing a multitude of ills, so that woes innumerous roam the breathing world. With ills the land is rife. Diseases haunt our frail humanity. In this account, the emergence of consciousness heralded the end of humanity's innocent golden age, when previously from evil free and labour's galling load, there emerged a situation where now swift the days of manhood haste away and misery pressure turns the temples grey. Yeah, we became psychologically distressed. So again, the elements of an original moral instinctive orientation, which then came into conflict with a conscious mind, were in these myths from ancient Greece. But of course, as in Moses' time, the science didn't exist that would make it possible to explain the redeeming good reason why the conflict occurred. Now, Plato, like Moses and Hesiod, is another very great thinker from ancient times. Indeed, Alfred North Whitehead, himself one of the highest regarded philosophers of the 20th century, described the history of philosophy as merely being a series of footnotes to Plato. Philosophy is the study of truths underlying all reality, and Plato, if he was the champion, as Whitehead said, of this study of the truths underlying reality, we can expect that Plato also recognised that this thing, moral instincts versus conscious intellect elements of the human condition, and he certainly did. In 360 BC, he gave this exceptionally honest description of our species' pre-conscious time and innocence. There was a time when we beheld the beatific vision and were united into a mystery which may be truly called blessed, celebrated by us in our state of innocence before we had any experience of evils to come, when we were admitted to the sight of apparitions innocent and simple and calm and happy, which we beheld shining in pure light, pure ourselves and not yet enshrined in that living tomb which we carry about now. Amazing. Plato also gave this other honest description of our innocent golden age in our species past. He wrote of a time when we lived a blessed and spontaneous life, where neither was there any violence or devouring of one another, or war or quarrel among them. In those days, God himself was their shepherd and ruled over them. In other words, our original instinctive self was orientated to living in an ideal, cooperative, loving way. Under him there was no forms of government or separate possession of women and children, for all men rose again from the earth having no memory of the past. In other words, they were living in a pre-conscious state. And the earth gave them fruit in abundance, which grew on trees and shrubs not planted by the hand of man. And they dwelt naked and mostly in the open air, for the temperature of their seasons was mild. and they had no beds, but lay on soft couches of grass, which grew plentifully out of the earth. When describing the emergence of consciousness and its corruption of our loving moral instincts, Plato also used a two-horse chariot analogy in which the conscious mind plunges and runs away, giving all manner of trouble to his companion, the companion obviously being our moral instinctive self, by perpetrating terrible and unlawful deeds. And elsewhere, Plato also described how after the emergence of consciousness, humans had to order their course of life for themselves and were their own masters. So yes, we developed a self-adjusting conscious mind. We were in charge of ourselves. After which occurred the separation, when the world was let go, which in other words, when the corrupt state of the human condition emerged. A situation where he said, at first all proceeded well enough. In other words, our intellect was mostly deferred to our instincts. But as time went on, there was more and more forgetting, this dishonest denial with its alienation, separation from our instinctive moral self, because it was criticising us more and more. And at last small was the good and great was the admixture of evil, and there was a danger of the universal ruin of the world. And that's the situation we have arrived at today, where the upset in humans is now so great we are facing universal ruin of the world. So see, if you print out a copy of the transcript, you can follow it like I am. Obviously, living at a time like Moses and Hesiod, Plato was unable to provide the redeeming instincts. The instincts can orientate, but only nerves can understand good reason why we departed from innocence and seemingly, as he described it, became evil or bad people. He didn't have the benefit of science to explain that we're actually good and not bad. I now want to interrupt this presentation of thinkers who have recognised the instinct versus intellect elements of the human condition and talk about our conscious mind's immense guilt and insecurity from having offended our species' particular moral instincts. To fully appreciate the agony of our human condition, we do need to immerse ourselves in the absolute horror of our predicament. If our species did once live in a wonderfully cooperative and loving, peaceful state, as the great thinkers I've just referred to recognise we did, then how extremely ashamed of our corrupted state must we be? I mean, the question that's just absolutely screaming out to be answered is, why on earth would we have been so seemingly stupid to have departed from such a wonderful state and existence? I mean, how are we to explain our species' so-called fall from grace? Why did we depart from our original Edenic, cooperative and loving, moral instinctive way of living and become brutally aggressive warmongers and egomaniacal competitors and psychotic and neurotic mad people? Why did we corrupt our all-loving, moral, instinctive self or soul? Why did we destroy paradise, turn utopia into dystopia? What? I mean, that's been the terrible predicament. How on earth could we explain and justify that seeming act of madness? We surely must be evil monsters. Now, I know that's the key linchpin question of how we humans could possibly be considered good when all the angry, egocentric and alienated behaviour we practice seems to unequivocally indicate the absolute opposite. Is the question that I'm arguing was finally answered in my presentation in the previous video, that with the self-adjusting conscious mind being unjustly condemned by our instincts explanation. However, to see just how wonderfully relieving that clarifying and exonerating and reconciling explanation of our corrupted condition is, I need to stay with this thought journey I'm following about our shame. So So the next realization to make is that trying to live with the implication that we are evil, worthless, utopia-destroying monsters has to have been absolutely unbearable, especially if we intuitively believed, as we have, that there had to be a reason, why we destroyed such a sharing, a selfless and loving paradise, and that one day we would find that redeeming explanation, which, as I've just said, I'm arguing we now have found. So yes, the great burden of guilt from the implication that we were despicable, evil monsters, especially when we didn't believe we deserved that condemnation, but they couldn't explain why, it has to have been absolutely unbearable. And if that situation is true, as I will go on and demonstrate that it is, then clearly it was absolutely imperative that we find some relieving excuse for our corrupted condition while we waited for the actual explanation to be found. And that's precisely where the savage instincts excuse came to our rescue. I mean, obviously untrue as it is, as I said, because we've got cooperative and loving moral instincts, not divisive, savage, brutal ones. But we could just apply a bit of mental self-deception and persuade ourselves, look, other animals are competing and fighting all the time, so that's our animal heritage as well. Basically just overlook the fact that we have loving moral instincts and determinedly embrace the savage instincts excuse. I mean, unsurprisingly, really, if you think about it, given the agony of our predicament, when we humans become psychologically cornered, any excuse will do. We just need to come up with one. And that's what we did with the savage instincts excuse. Again, as Tony Gowing said in the second video of this series, this excuse that we have savage animal instincts that are driven by a need to reproduce our genes like other animals is the excuse that virtually everyone's been using for our competitive and aggressive behaviour. We deluded ourselves that other animals constantly compete and fight with each other in an effort to make sure they reproduce their genes, and that's what our forebears did. And so that's where our brutal, competitive and aggressive nature comes from, which we being our conscious self, supposedly have to spend all our lives trying to control. But again, as Tony pointed out, the savage instincts excuse theory is simply not true. It's just a convenient excuse we came up with. Because firstly, we humans don't have savage, competitive and aggressive instincts. We have cooperative and loving moral instincts, the voice or expression of which is our conscience. Recall, what Darwin's words, the moral sense affords the best and highest distinction between man and the lower animals. And secondly, and this is the second point that Tony made in the second video, words used to describe human behaviour, such as egocentric and arrogant, inspired, depressed, deluded, pessimistic, optimistic, hateful, cynical, mean, immoral, brilliant, guilt-ridden, evil, psychotic, neurotic, they all recognise the involvement of our species' fully conscious thinking mind. They demonstrate that there's a psychological dimension to our behaviour, that we don't suffer from a genetic opportunism-driven animal condition, but the psychologically troubled human condition. If we do have cooperative and loving moral instincts, which as Darwin said we do, and not competitive and aggressive ones like other animals, then those cooperative and loving instincks must have come from a time when our forebears, presumably our distant ape ancestors, lived cooperatively and lovingly. Otherwise, how would we acquire them? And in fact, our ape ancestors did live cooperatively and lovingly. And I'll explain shortly how they managed to achieve that wonderful, gentle sharing and cooperative, peaceful way of living that Moses and Hesiod and Plato and many other great thinkers of old recognised they did live like. But as I've emphasised, the immense problem we have had with this truth that our ancestors were cooperative and loving is that it has been absolutely unbearably condemning of our present corrupted condition, which means we simply had to find a way to deny it, which again is where the savage instincts excuse came to our rescue. We do have to bottom out on how diabolical our situation has been. It wasn't until science revealed the difference between instinctive orientations and conscious understandings that we were finally in a position to explain the real reason for our competitive and aggressive behaviour. So until we found out about nerves and genes and how they work. Every time we thought truthfully about our corrupted innocence destroyed, Garden of Eden obliterated, human condition afflicted situation, the only conclusion we could come to was that we must be evil monsters. Without the ability that science has given us to explain about nerves and genes, we were completely stuck. Absolutely having no ability at all to truthfully explain ourselves. Now, if you think about it, science has only found out about the existence of genes and nerves and how they work in the last 160 years or so. I mean, since Darwin came up with he's published his theories about natural selection. That's a staggering amount of time. We fully conscious humans have had to live on this earth without the ability to truthfully explain ourselves, which is some 2 million years, in fact, because that's the approximate time we've been fully conscious. So now we can see how important it was to deny our ancestors lived cooperatively and lovingly, and instead to delude ourselves they were savage brutes trying to reproduce their genes like other animals. Because without that denial and that excuse, we simply wouldn't have been able to live with ourselves throughout all that time, those 2 million years. We can also now see what an absolutely incredible relief it is to finally be able to have the real reason for our corrupted condition and no longer have to carry on, the charade of believing in this false savage instincts excuse. And there's not only the relief of no longer having to lie like fools, this true understanding that we now have of the human condition allows every human to no longer have to live in a defensive and retaliatory, egocentric and aggressive existence. We can be transformed to living free of the human condition, which is just the most fabulous change that Tony Gowing is going to describe in the next video. And I'll further describe it in Freedom Essay 15. So there's really no comparison between life we've had to live up to the present, now that we can finally explain the human condition truthfully, and what our existence has been like up till now. Unable to truthfully explain ourselves and defend our corrupted condition. We had to wait for science to find out about nerves and genes that finally make clarifying, redeeming, exonerating explanation of our lives possible. Since it's likely been a very pressing question in your the listener or if you're reading the transcript, the mind of your mind, I'll now briefly explain how our distant ape ancestors came to live in a cooperative and loving instinctive state. Indeed, this question of how we humans acquired our moral instincts, our moral instinctive selfless soul, the voice or expression of which is our conscience, has been one of the great outstanding biological questions. And the reason it has been such a huge question for us biologists is because we know that genes normally cannot select for unconditionally altruistic, selfless traits, simply because such traits tend to self-eliminate and so normally can't become established. I mean, by all means, you can be selfless towards me and sacrifice your genes, but I'm not about to be selfless towards you and sacrifice my genes for you. So this process of natural selection dictates that selfish opportunism will supposedly always exploit selflessness. So how could such a selfish process as natural selection possibly have created such a loving selflessness in us? So that's the key biological question, or one of the key biological questions. Now, as I'll explain in much greater detail in Freedom Essay 21, the way it was achieved in our forebears was through nurturing. Okay. So how did nurturing achieve this wonderful, cooperative, loving state? To explain what is so significant about a mother's nurturing of her offspring, I first need to point out that a mother's maternal instincts to care for her offspring is selfish because she is ensuring the reproduction of her genes by looking after her offspring, who obviously carry her genes. So maternalism is a selfish trait, which, as I just said, genetic traits normally have to be for them to reproduce and carry on to the next generation. However, and this is all important, if we think about it, from the infant's perspective, maternalism does have the appearance of being selfless. From the infant's perspective, it is being treated unconditionally selflessly. The mother is giving her offspring food and warmth and shelter and support and protection for apparently nothing in return. So if we think about it, it follows that if the infant can remain in infancy for an extended period and be treated with a lot of seemingly altruistic love from its mother, it will be indoctrinated with that selfless love and grow up and behave accordingly. As I explained much more in detail in Freedom Essay 21, selfish maternalism can train an infant in altruistic selflessness. And if we think about primates, being semi-upright from living in the trees, swinging through the branches, and thus having their arms free to hold a dependent infant, it's clear that they are especially facilitated to support and prolong the mother-infant relationship, and so develop this nurtured, loving, cooperative behaviour. In fact, the bonobo variety of chimpanzee that live south of the Congo River are extraordinarily matriarchal or female role focused and extraordinarily nurturing, as these photos illustrate. You can see the mother's attentiveness, and they're absolutely doting on their infants and so immersed in them. They're wonderfully nurturing. And as a result of this nurturing, bonobos are the most cooperative and loving of all primates, which these quotes that I'll now read evidence. So this is a quote from Barbara Bell, who's the bonobo zookeeper. Adult bonobos demonstrate tremendous compassion for each other. For example, Kitty, the oldest female, is completely blind and hard of hearing. Sometimes she gets lost and confused. They'll just pick her up and take her to where she needs to go. This is another quote from Sue Savage-Rumbaugh, a primatologist. Bonobo life is centred around the offspring. Unlike what happens among chimpanzees, all members of the bonobo social group help with infant care and share food with infants. If you're a bonobo infant, you can do no wrong. Bonobo females and their infants form the core of the group. And this is a quote from one of the filmmakers of the French documentary Bonobos. They're surely the most fascinating animal on the planet. They're the closest animals to man. Once I got hit on the head with a branch that had a bonobo on it. I sat down and the bonobo noticed I was in a difficult situation and came and took me by the hand and moved my hair back like they do. So they live on compassion, and that's really interesting to experience. There's amazing quotes. Now this is a quote from bonobo researcher Vanessa Wood's first-hand account of bonobos' unlimited capacity for love. I mean, she's studying them in the Congo Basin. Bonobo love is like a laser beam. They stop, they stare at you as though they have been waiting their whole lives for you to walk into their jungle. And then they love you with such helpless abandon that you have to love them back. You have to love them back. It's extraordinary how loving they are. And bonobos are genetically our closest living relatives. So we can see that bonobos provide the perfect evidence for how our distant ape ancestors became cooperative and loving. You can read a lot more about the amazing nurtured cooperativeness in bonobo life in Freedom Essay 21. This picture of a group of bonobos resting on a grassy glade perfectly equates with the description that Plato gave earlier about what life was like for humans back in the golden age of nurtured togetherness. And so this is this photograph. It has all these bonobos sitting on some grass. And what did Plato say? And they dwelt naked and mostly in the open air, for the temperature of their season was mild, and they had no beds, but lay on soft couches of grass, which grew plentifully out of the earth. I mean, clearly, we have perfect instinctive memory, if we don't choose to deny it, of what life was like before the fall, because Plato didn't know about the existence of bonobos, and yet knew exactly what our bonobo-like life was like before the fall. Extraordinary. Your next question may well be, but why haven't I heard about this reasonably obvious nurturing explanation for humans' moral nature before now? Well, just like the obvious truth that our species once lived cooperatively and lovingly, this truth that we acquired our moral instincts through nurturing has been an unbearable truth, while we couldn't explain why we humans became competitive, aggressive, and as a result lost the ability to adequately nurture our offspring with unconditional selflessness or love. I mean, the truth of our species' Edenic, cooperative, innocent and loving past, and this truth that nurturing is what made us human, have both been impossible truths to accept, while we couldn't truthfully explain the human condition. Explain why our species became corrupted and lost the ability to fully nurture our offspring, its offspring. I mean, as people often say, you know, parents would rather admit to being an axe murderer than a bad mother or father. Again, Freedom Essay 21 explains in much more detail how nurturing gave us our moral instincts. The main point about what has now been explained is that until science revealed the difference in the way genes and nerves work, and by so doing made it possible to truthfully explain why we humans became competitive and aggressive and selfish, which again I'm suggesting is the explanation I presented in the previous video, we had no choice other than to use the dishonest, savage instincts excuse for our divisive behaviour. Now, this does raise the question that since these understandings of how genes and nerves work became known some 160 years ago, why hasn't the instinct versus intellect explanation I've just given for our human condition been found before now? And why hasn't science raced to acknowledge this all-important discovery? The reason it hasn't been found is that almost all scientists, like virtually every other human, have been deeply committed to avoiding the unbearably confronting issue of the human condition, the terrifying question of why we are so corrupted and soul-destroyed, and as a result, habituated to using the savage instincts excuse to defend themselves. So I had to be thinking independent of the prevailing scientific thought, to be thinking truthfully enough about the human condition to solve it. And in terms of having that understanding accepted by the scientific establishment, science has always been slow to move to a new paradigm of thinking, especially when the new paradigm is a more truthful one, which is a difficulty that playwright George Bernard Shaw recognised when he say, all great truths begin as blasphemies. You can learn much more about science's entrenched denial of the human condition and about its extremely dangerous perpetuation of the savage instincts excuse in Freedom Essay 14 and in Chapter 2 of my book Freedom. Indeed, Freedom Essay 14 gives a very powerful description of all the dishonesty in science and where that dishonesty has been taking us, which is actually straight to extinction. So that brings us to the main point of this presentation, which is that you will know that the explanation of the human condition that I put forward is the true explanation, because if we think truthfully about the human condition, instead of dishonesty living in denial of it, as virtually everyone, including scientists have been doing, then it becomes apparent that the instinct versus intellect explanation is the completely obvious, fully accountable, and thus true explanation of our divisive behaviour. And this obviousness is made abundantly clear by the many great thinkers throughout history who have recognised those instinct versus intellect elements, such as the ones I've already mentioned. from ancient history and the ones I'm about to mention from contemporary times. As you will see, while none of these thinkers has managed to fully explain the human condition, in some cases because in their time science had yet to reveal the nature of the gene and nerve-based learning systems, all of them recognise the key ingredients involved in that honest and true explanation of our conscious mind being at odds with our instincts. However, while all these thinkers have recognised the fundamental instinct versus intellect ingredients involved in producing the psychologically upset state of the human condition, you will notice that amongst the contemporary thinkers that I'm about to mention, there is a variance in how honest each has been prepared to be about those instincts within us being cooperative and loving, not competitive and aggressive. Not all contemporary thinkers that I'm going to mention have been able to acknowledge the truth of our cooperative and loving past, because the more upset and angry and egocentric the human race became through this historic search for knowledge, the more unbearably confronting the truth of our past state of innocence obviously became as well. So it follows that in earlier times, when the upset, angry, egocentric and alienated state of the human condition wasn't as developed as it is now, there would have been more truthful acknowledgement of our species' cooperative and loving heritage and of its corruption when we became conscious, which is what the examples from ancient times clearly demonstrate. They were able to acknowledge those truths. Now, even so, while all the thinkers from the less upset, more innocent and naive ancient times that I've referred to earlier were able to acknowledge our cooperative and loving heritage, there were already, even in those earlier times, many people who wanted to deny it. And we know this because Plato told us of its occurrence in those earlier times when he wrote that this tradition of the innocent earthborn man, which is nowadays often unduly discredited, our ancestors, in the form of the existing relatively innocent races of people, such as we know now of those that still exist, like the Bushmen of the Kalahari and the Australian Aboriginal, who were nearest in point of time to the end of that last period and came into being at the beginning of this new period, a more upset period, to us the heralds of that earlier innocent age. Even in Plato's time, he says there was this truth of a cooperative past was often nowadays unduly discredited, denied. So even though there is in modern times even more denial of our species' innocent past than was occurring in Plato's time, when he lamented that our innocent past is a nowadays, in his time, often unduly discredited, as you will see in the following collection of contemporary thinkers who have recognised the basic instinct versus intellect elements involved in producing the human condition, there are still those who have truthfully recognised both the basic elements and that our instincts were cooperative and loving. Again, the source of all these quotes in this presentation can be found in the longer version of this presentation in Freedom Essay 53, where many more acknowledgements of our conscious mind's corruption of our original state of innocence are recorded. In identifying the role of instinct and intellect in producing the human condition, the South African naturalist Eugene Murray was on the right track when he recognised in one of his books that the great frontier between the two types of mentality is the line which separates non-primate mammals from apes and monkeys. On one side of that line, behaviour is dominated by hereditary memory, and on the other by individual causal memory. The phylactic history, in other words, evolutionary development, of the primate soul can be clearly traced in the mental evolution of the human child. The highest primate man is born an instinctive animal. All of its behaviour for a long period after birth is dominated by the instinctive mentality. It has no memory, no conception of cause and effect, no consciousness. As the new soul, the soul of the individual memory, slowly emerges, the instinctive soul becomes just as slowly submerged. For a time, it is almost as though there was a struggle between the two. Murray also recognised that the instinct is incapable of deviation from a certain fixed way of behaving. This inherited memory is in every respect a terrible tyrant. He further realised that the so-called subliminal soul in man, the subconscious mentality, is none other than this old instinctive mentality, animal instinctive mentality, which has been put out of action by the new conscious mentality. So we can recognise much of the Adam Stalk analogy that I used to explain the human condition in the previous video in Murray's description of becoming conscious, and as consciousness emerged, a struggle, as he described it, with the inflexible tyrannical instincts erupting. We can see that Murray not only acknowledged the elements of instinct and conscious intellect involved in the human condition, he was considering how the two elements actually interacted. I mean, had he pursued and developed his insight into the emerging struggle between the inflexible tyrannical instinctive soul or hereditary memory and the new conscious cause and effect based memory, he could have realised, as I did, that the good reason why the conscious intellect had to defy the tyrannical instincts was because the conscious mind had to search for understanding of cause and effect. And further, that it was that particular guilt-producing struggle that caused the upset, competitive and aggressive and selfish, corrupted human condition. So that's an amazingly honest and penetrating analysis by Murray of the origin of our corrupted human condition. The next person whose work I want to look at is Sir Lawrence van der Post, whose life and work you can read a lot more about in Freedom Essay 51. Sir Lawrence wrote extensively about the relatively innocent Bushman people of the Kalahari Desert of South Africa. And what is relevant here is that Sir Lawrence, who I regard as the preeminent philosopher of the 20th century, and who, like Murray, was from South Africa, had an honest, denial-free ability to acknowledge the involvement of our moral instincts and corrupting intellect in producing the upset state of the human condition. As we can see from this passage from Sir Lawrence's writing, he bravely acknowledged that before the dawning of individual consciousness, humans did live in a state of togetherness, a state that he said we have an unappeasable homesickness at the base of the human heart to return to. So this is what he wrote. This shrill, brittle, self-important life of today is by comparison a graveyard, where the living are dead and the dead are alive and talking through our soul in the still, small, clear voice of a love and trust in life that we have for the moment lost. There was a time when all on earth and in the universe were still members and family of the early race, seeking comfort and warmth through the long, cold night before the dawning of individual consciousness, in a togetherness which still gnaws like an unappeasable homesickness at the base of the human heart. I mean, that's just wonderful. In an even more explicit reference, Sir Lawrence also recognised the actual war that exists between our originally innocent instinctive self and our newer conscious intellect, writing that I spoke to you earlier of this dark child of nature, this other primitive man within each of us, with whom we are at war within our spirit. We can see that while Sir Lawrence was able to clearly recognise the war between our original innocent, instinctive, soulful child of nature, our newer sort of individual conscious intellect or spirit, he didn't provide the critically important reconciling and redeeming good biological reason for why the war occurred. I should note that in recognising the relative innocence of the Bushman people of the Kalahari, Sir Lawrence defiantly rebelled against the practice of denial of the truth that we humans did once live in an upset-free innocent state prior to the emergence of the human condition. For example, he wrote that there was indeed a cruelly denied and neglected first child of life, a Bushman in each of us. He even described the relative uncorrupted harmony and sensitivity of the more innocent state of the Bushman, writing that he and his needs were committed to the nature of Africa and to the swing of its wide seasons as a fish is to the sea. He and they all participate so deeply in one another's being that the experience could almost be called mystical. For instance, he seemed to know what it actually felt like to be an elephant, a lion, an antelope, a stenbuck, a lizard, a striped mouse, a baobab tree, to mention only a few of the brilliant multitudes through which he so nimbly moved. Even as a child, it seemed to me that his world was one without secrets between one form of being and another. Amazing words. There's the Swiss-born philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who similarly expressed what we all do intuitively know is the truth when he wrote that nothing is more gentle than man in his primitive state, and that man is born free but is everywhere in chains. While Rousseau never actually used the term noble savage, these quotes show why he's been associated with that concept. When Sir Lawrence spoke of the relative innocent bushman seeming to know what it actually felt like to be a striped mouse and a baobab tree, I'm reminded of the great Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky's intuitive remembrance of our species' bonobo-like time in innocence, a time when he wrote, the grass glowed with bright and fragrant flowers. Birds were flying in flocks in the air, and perched fearlessly on my shoulder and arms and joyfully struck me with their darling fluttering wings. And at last I saw and knew the people of this happy land. They came to me of themselves, surrounded me, kissed me. The children of the sun, the children of their son. Oh, how beautiful they were. Their faces were radiant. In their words and voices there was a note of childlike joy. It was the earth untarnished by the fall. On it lived people who had not sinned. They desired nothing and were at peace. They did not aspire to knowledge of life as we aspire to understand it, because their lives were full, but their knowledge was higher and deeper than ours. But I could not understand their knowledge. They showed me their trees, and I could not understand their intense love with which they looked at them. It was as though they were talking with creatures like themselves, and I'm convinced that the trees understood them. They looked at all of nature like that, at the animals who lived in peace with them and did not attack them but loved them, conquered by their love. There was no quarrelling, no jealousy among them, for they all made up one family. This description of being conquered by love is so like what the bonobo researcher Vanessa Woods said about bonobos earlier, isn't it? She said, bonobo love is like a laser beam. They stop, they stare at you as though they've been waiting their whole lives for you to walk into their jungle. And then they love you with such helpless abandon that you love them back. You have to love them back. Another Russian philosopher, Nikolai Berdyaev, also bravely acknowledged and wrote that the memory of a lost paradise of a golden age is very deep in man. He was also approaching the truth about the actual cause of the human condition when he wrote that man is an irrational, paradoxical, essentially tragic being in whom two worlds, two opposite principles are at war. And in describing those two principles, he also wrote that the human soul is divided. An agonizing conflict between opposing elements is going on. The distinction between the conscious and the subconscious mind is fundamental to the new psychology. It surely is. So it's all there, the instinct at war with the intellect. But again, what's missing is the reconciling explanation. What is actually, it is about the distinction between the conscious intellect and subconscious mind that causes them to be in agonizing conflict. The German psychologist Erich Neumann was another who recognized the battle and rift between humans' already established non-understanding, unconscious, instinctual self and a newer conscious intellect. In his 1949 book, The Origin and History of Consciousness, he wrote that whereas originally the opposites could function side by side without undue strain and without excluding one another, now with the development and elaboration of the opposition between conscious and unconscious, they fly apart. That is to say, it is no longer possible for an object to be loved and hated at the same time. Ego and consciousness identify themselves in principle with one side of the opposition and leave the other in the subconscious, either preventing it from coming up at all, i.e. consciously suppressing it, or else repressing it, i.e. eliminating it from consciousness without being aware of doing so. Only deep psychological analysis can then discover the unconscious counterposition. Yes, so when we destroyed the Garden of Eden innocent state, we were so ashamed of it, we repressed it. So now it's part of our subconscious awareness. But the key question persists. Why did the elaboration of the conscious self cause it to fly apart from the unconscious instinctive self? In the 1950s, the American neurologist Paul MacLean developed his theory of the triune brain, which states that humans are a mentally unbalanced species because of an inadequate coordination, he said, between our emotional old brain and cognitive new brain. He proposed that humans have not one brain, but three, each originating from a different stage in our evolutionary history. He said that the inner original reptilian brain, which he said tends to be rigid and compulsive, and then there's the middle limbic brain, which he said comprises the amygdala and the hypothalamus and hippocampus, and is prominent in lower mammals, and is concerned with emotion and instincts. And thirdly, he said there's the outer cerebral cortex brain of higher mammals, which is concerned with reason, invention, abstract thought. He wrote that the three evolutionary formations might be imagined as three interconnected biological computers, each with having its own special intelligence, its own subjectivity, its own sense of time and space, and its own memory, motor and other functions. Because of the independence between these three brains, MacLean saw them as frequently being dissociated and in conflict. But again, he's failed to explain what it is about the different intelligences and resulting subjectivities and senses of time and space and memories that actually causes the conflict between these two particular brains. And then there's the British science philosopher Arthur Koestler, who referred to Paul MacLean's concept that the brain explosion in humans gave rise to a mentally unbalanced species in which old brain and new brain, emotion and intellect, faith and reason were at loggerheads. Koestler claimed that as a result of an inadequate coordination between these two areas of the brain, the rational neocortex and the instinctual hypothalamus, man had somehow acquired the unique murderous delusional streak that propelled him inevitably to murder, to torture and to war. This recognition of humans having an old instinctive brain and a newer cognitive brain that are at loggerheads because of an inadequate coordination between the two was on the right track to explaining the human condition. But again, the reconciling, redeeming good reason for the inadequate coordination was not provided by either MacLean or Koestler. So these are some of the honest thinkers referred to in Freedom Essay 53 who recognised the fundamental instinct versus intellect elements involved in producing a psychologically upset human condition. Other thinkers referred to in that essay include Julian Jaynes, Christopher Booker, William Wordsworth, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Blake, Robert A. Johnson, and Bruce Chatwin. So hopefully now, as a result of this presentation, you have some understanding of why we had to use the savage instincts excuse, and will now agree that the instinct versus intellect explanation of the human condition that I presented in the previous video is the obvious and real explanation of that condition. And if it is that now desperately needed reconciling and psychologically healing and transforming explanation of our angry and egocentric and alienated lives, which it clearly is, then you and everyone else can enjoy that dreamed of transformation of your life from a human condition stricken state to a fabulous human condition free one, which Tony Gowing describes in the next video, and I will further describe in Freedom Essay 15. Yes, the unappeasable homesickness at the base of the human heart for the togetherness that existed before the dawning of individual consciousness, that Sir Lawrence van der Post wrote so wonderfully and truthfully about, can finally be appeased. As the poet T.S. Eliot accurately described our human journey from ignorance to enlightenment, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So now, please watch Tony Gowing describe the fabulous transformed life that's now available for everyone.